December 16, 1944. 0530 hours. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's hand trembled slightly as he read the decoded message from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The British commander had just demanded, complete operational control of all American forces north of the Ardennes. Outside, the German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was tearing through American lines. Inside this ornate French palace, another battle was brewing, one that would poison Allied command relationships and nearly shatter the coalition that was winning the war. What followed wasn't just a clash of tactical philosophies or national pride. It was a fundamental conflict between two visions of warfare, two concepts of leadership, and two men whose egos would prove nearly as destructive as German panzers. The Americans called Montgomery Monty the Magnificent, but never to his face, and never without bitter sarcasm dripping from every syllable. The seeds of hatred were planted long before the Ardennes snow turned red with American blood. They took root in the burning sands of North Africa, grew through the olive groves of Sicily, and reached full poisonous bloom on the beaches of Normandy. Bernard Montgomery had arrived in Egypt on August 13, 1942, carrying with him a reputation forged at Dunkirk and a certainty in his own genius that bordered on the messianic. Within hours of assuming command of the British Eighth Army, he had begun reshaping not just tactics, but the very philosophy of how the British Empire would fight its wars. Montgomery's approach to warfare was methodical, mathematical, almost industrial in its precision. He would not attack until he possessed overwhelming superiority, 3-to-1 in infantry, 4-to-1 in armor, complete air supremacy, and supply stockpiles sufficient to sustain operations for weeks without resupply. His planning sessions became legendary for their detail, casualty projections calculated to the dozen, ammunition expenditure predicted to the ton, advance rates measured to the yard per hour. At El Alamein in October 1942, this approach had worked brilliantly. Montgomery had amassed 195,000 men against Rommel's 104,000, 1,029 tanks against 489, and 750 aircraft against 675. He had rehearsed the battle for weeks, wargamed every contingency, and refused to attack until every supply dump was filled to capacity. When the assault finally came on October 23, it proceeded exactly according to his master plan, grinding, attritional, but ultimately victorious. The British press declared him a genius. Winston Churchill called him a modern Wellington. King George VI awarded him the Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. Montgomery himself drew a different conclusion. He had discovered the formula for victory, and any deviation from this formula was not just wrong, but criminally negligent. This conviction would shape every interaction he had with American commanders for the remainder of the war. When American generals proposed bold armored thrusts, Montgomery saw recklessness. When they advocated broad front advances, he perceived military ignorance. When they suggested attacking before achieving his preferred numerical superiority, he viewed it as murder. The Americans, for their part, had developed an entirely different philosophy of warfare. Shaped by their nation's vast industrial capacity and cultural embrace of mobility and aggression, American doctrine emphasized speed over security, exploitation over consolidation, and acceptable risk over absolute certainty. General George S. Patton Jr. embodied this approach perfectly. His Third Army could advance 50 miles in a day when Montgomery's forces moved 5. His staff planning took hours where Montgomery's took weeks. He would attack with even odds if the opportunity was right, trusting American initiative and firepower to compensate for numerical parity. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, though less flamboyant than Patton, shared this fundamental philosophy. Bradley believed in trusting subordinate commanders, in flexible responses to changing conditions, in seizing fleeting opportunities even when the textbook solution wasn't yet available. These weren't just tactical preferences, they were expressions of national character, industrial capability, and military culture. And they were completely incompatible with Montgomery's vision of warfare. July 10, 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, marked the first time American and British forces would conduct a major combined operation under a unified command structure. It also marked the first time Montgomery's methods would directly clash with American operational style, creating fractures that would never fully heal. The planning for Sicily had been contentious from the start. General Harold Alexander, the overall ground commander, had essentially allowed Montgomery to rewrite the invasion plan to suit his preferences. Montgomery's revisions reduced the American 7th Army under Patton to what amounted to a flank guard for his British 8th Army, which would execute the main effort toward Messina. The operational plan reflected Montgomery's characteristic caution: limited objectives, secure supply lines, methodical advance. American planners found themselves relegated to supporting roles, their suggestions for bold armored thrusts dismissed as strategically unsound. When the invasion commenced, the pattern Montgomery had established in Africa repeated itself. The British 8th Army advanced methodically up the eastern coast, 5 miles on day 1, 8 miles on day 2, pausing frequently to bring up supplies and ensure flanks were secure. Each village was thoroughly cleared, each crossroad properly secured, each supply dump fully stocked before the advance continued. Meanwhile, Patton's 7th Army, frustrated at being assigned a secondary role, began what would become a legendary race to Palermo and then Messina. On July 22, Patton's forces covered 100 miles in 3 days, captured Palermo, and wheeled east toward Messina, the ultimate objective that had been assigned to Montgomery. The contrast was stark and documented in both armies' after-action reports. British forces advanced an average of 4 miles per day with minimal casualties. American forces advanced 15 to 20 miles per day, accepting higher casualties but achieving objectives weeks ahead of schedule. What should have been a moment for celebration of Allied cooperation instead became a source of bitter recrimination. Montgomery's official report, filed on August 17, 1943, contained thinly veiled criticism of American recklessness and suggested that Patton's rapid advance had been strategically meaningless because it hadn't trapped German forces. Patton's response, recorded in his diary and shared widely among American commanders, was characteristically blunt: "Montgomery is a tired little fart. War requires the taking of risks. The winner is the commander who takes the right risks, not the one who refuses to take any risks at all." But the deeper issue wasn't just speed versus caution, it was respect. Montgomery's dispatches and conference statements consistently conveyed the assumption that British military judgment was superior to American, that British officers were more professionally competent, and that American forces required British guidance to avoid disasters born of inexperience. Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott, commanding the American 3rd Infantry Division, documented Montgomery's attitude in his memoirs. He spoke to American commanders as a headmaster might address particularly slow students. There was never consultation, only instruction. Never partnership, only patronage. The American High Command began compiling what would become an extensive file of Montgomery's statements and actions. General Eisenhower, trying desperately to maintain Allied unity, found himself spending more time managing Montgomery's relationship with American commanders than planning operations against the Germans. June 6, 1944. D-Day. While American forces struggled bloodily through Omaha Beach and fought their way inland through the Norman hedgerows, Montgomery's British and Canadian forces landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches with a clear, ambitious objective: capture the city of Cannes on D-Day itself. Cannes was vital. The city sat at the hinge of the Allied beachhead, controlled access to the tank country beyond, and offered the space needed to build up forces for the breakout that would liberate France. Montgomery's pre-invasion plan, circulated to all Allied commanders, explicitly stated that Cannes would fall on June 6, enabling rapid exploitation toward Falaise. The city didn't fall on June 6. Nor on June 7. Nor on June 8. Days became weeks, and weeks stretched into a month as British forces battered themselves against German defenses that had never been present in Montgomery's appreciable intelligence estimates. What emerged from Montgomery's headquarters wasn't an acknowledgement of failed planning or unexpected German resistance. Instead, a remarkable transformation occurred in the official narrative. By June 10, Montgomery's dispatches to Eisenhower began suggesting that the real plan had always been to draw German armor onto the British sector, allowing American forces to break out in the West. By June 15, this revision had become Montgomery's official position. The struggle for Caen wasn't a failure to achieve objectives, it was a brilliant strategic conception to pin German forces in place. The fact that this brilliant conception bore no resemblance to the actual D-Day plan seemed irrelevant to Montgomery. American commanders were incredulous. Lieutenant General Bradley, whose First Army was indeed facing lighter opposition than expected, recognized that German armor had concentrated against the British, but this was clearly a German reaction to where the threat appeared greatest, not the result of Montgomery's master plan. The situation deteriorated through July. Operation Goodwood, launched on July 18, was supposed to be Montgomery's decisive armored breakthrough. He had assembled 750 tanks and promised Eisenhower a penetration that would loose the armored divisions into the open country about Falaise. The result was a costly battle that gained 7 miles at the cost of 400 tanks and 5,500 casualties before grinding to a halt. Yet within 24 hours, Montgomery was declaring Goodwood a complete success, claiming it had achieved exactly what he'd intended, wearing down German armor. For American commanders, this pattern of promising breakthrough, delivering stalemate, and then claiming the stalemate was the plan all along became infuriating. General Bradley's Chief of Staff, Major General William Keane, documented the American perspective in a classified memorandum dated July 20. "We are watching a master of self-promotion rewrite history in real time. Objectives not achieved become objectives never intended. Failures become successes through linguistic gymnastics that would impress Orwell." The hatred crystallizing in American headquarters wasn't about tactical setbacks, those happened to everyone. It was about the refusal to acknowledge reality, the constant self-aggrandizement, and the implicit suggestion that only Montgomery truly understood the battle while Americans were merely fortunate beneficiaries of his strategic genius. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. September 17, 1944. 1,300 hours. The largest airborne operation in military history commenced as 35,000 Allied paratroopers dropped into Holland. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's audacious plan to end the war by Christmas, was finally underway. For once, the cautious Field Marshal had proposed a bold stroke: airborne forces would seize bridges across the Rhine while armored columns raced 64 miles through German-occupied territory to link up with them. American commanders had been stunned when Montgomery presented the plan on September 10. This was completely contrary to everything he had advocated for 3 years. The operation violated every principle of his methodical warfare. It relied on speed over preparation, audacity over overwhelming force, and optimism over careful intelligence assessment. General Bradley's initial reaction, recorded in his daily log, was skeptical. Montgomery has finally decided to take a risk. Unfortunately, he's chosen to take it with airborne forces that can't be reinforced and along a single road that offers no maneuver room. This is either brilliance or madness, and I suspect the latter. The plan assigned the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions to capture bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, while British 1st Airborne Division would seize the final bridge at Arnhem. Lieutenant General Brian Horrock's XXX Corps would drive up the single highway, linking the bridges into a corridor leading across the Rhine. What followed was a masterclass in optimistic planning meeting harsh reality. The operation suffered from intelligence failures that American commanders found inexcusable. Dutch resistance had reported 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. British intelligence officer Major Brian Urquhart had obtained reconnaissance photos showing German armor in the drop zones. Montgomery's headquarters dismissed both reports as exaggerated. American airborne commanders, receiving their briefings, were appalled at the basic assumptions. The drops would occur in daylight, alerting every German unit in Holland. The single road to Arnhem was elevated above marshy terrain. One blown bridge would stop the entire advance. There were no contingency plans, no alternative routes, no reserves. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, recorded his private assessment on September 15. This plan assumes everything will go right. In my experience, everything never goes right. But Montgomery has sold this to Eisenhower as the war-winning stroke, so we'll do our duty and pray. The American airborne divisions performed magnificently, seizing their objectives despite fierce resistance. The 82nd Airborne captured the massive bridge at Nijmegen after a daring river crossing that cost 200 casualties. But XXX Corps' advance was exactly as slow as American planners had feared, delayed by German resistance, confined to a single road, unable to maneuver or reinforce. At Arnhem, British 1st Airborne Division was being systematically destroyed by the SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had dismissed. Of 10,000 men dropped, only 2,400 would escape. The bridge was never taken. The Rhine was never crossed. The war would not end by Christmas. Montgomery's response to the disaster was characteristically self-serving. In his report dated September 28, he declared Market Garden 90% successful because most bridges had been captured. The fact that the critical final bridge, the entire point of the operation, had not been taken seemed, in his assessment, a minor detail. December 16, 1944. 0530 hours. The German offensive in the Ardennes exploded across American lines with a fury that caught Allied intelligence completely by surprise. Within hours, Eisenhower faced the greatest crisis of his command, a massive German breakthrough threatening to split Allied armies and possibly reach the vital port of Antwerp. At 1100 hours that same morning, Montgomery's message arrived at SHAEF headquarters. It didn't offer assistance or express concern for embattled American forces. Instead, it contained a thinly veiled "I told you so" and a demand for command authority over all Allied forces north of the breakthrough. The message, preserved in SHAEF files, reflected Montgomery's certainty in his own judgment. The present situation arises from the failure to concentrate forces for a single decisive thrust, as I have consistently advocated. American forces are in disarray. I am prepared to assume command of all units north of the penetration to restore order and mount a proper counteroffensive. For American commanders bleeding in the Ardennes, this was an unforgivable response. Their men were dying in frozen foxholes, holding critical road junctions against overwhelming odds, buying time for reinforcements to arrive, and Montgomery was positioning himself to claim credit for the inevitable recovery. General Bradley's reaction was volcanic. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hanson, recorded the scene. The general read Montgomery's message and I thought he would have apoplexy. He called Montgomery every name I've heard in 20 years of military service, and invented several new ones. He swore he would resign his commission before serving under that insufferable, self-promoting British bastard. Eisenhower, trapped between military necessity and command relationships, made the decision that would haunt him. On December 20, he placed Montgomery in tactical command of all Allied forces north of the Bulge, including the American 1st and 9th Armies. It was militarily sound. Montgomery's headquarters was better positioned to coordinate the northern response. But it was psychologically devastating to American commanders. Montgomery's subsequent behavior confirmed every American suspicion about his character. He arrived at American headquarters on December 20 in what Bradley's staff described as a victor's procession, wearing his trademark beret, accompanied by a large entourage, and projecting an air of a headmaster arriving to rescue incompetent students from their own mistakes. His first conference with American commanders became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, documented Montgomery's opening remarks. He began by explaining what had gone wrong, essentially, everything we had done. He then outlined how he would restore the situation, essentially, by doing everything his way. There was no acknowledgement of American forces already stabilizing the situation, no recognition that our men had blunted the German offensive. Only Montgomery, arriving like a savior to rescue Americans from American mistakes. The final insult came on January 7, 1945. When Montgomery held a press conference. Speaking to British and American journalists, he portrayed the Battle of the Bulge as a situation where American forces had been routed until British leadership restored order. He spoke of himself in the third person. As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps to ensure that the Germans would never reach the Meuse. January 8, 1945. 0800 hours. General Bradley's headquarters, Luxembourg. The telephone conversation that morning between Bradley and Eisenhower nearly shattered the Allied command structure. Bradley, having read the reports of Montgomery's press conference, delivered an ultimatum that Eisenhower had never expected from his most stable, reliable subordinate. "I cannot and will not serve under Montgomery's command any longer," Bradley stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. "If Montgomery remains in command of American forces, you'll need to find a new 12th Army Group commander. This is not a threat, Ike. It's a statement of fact. I will resign my commission before I'll execute another order from that arrogant son of a bitch." Bradley's rebellion wasn't isolated. By noon, Eisenhower's headquarters had received similar messages from Patton, Hodges, and even the normally diplomatic General William Simpson. The American High Command, united in little else, stood unified in their refusal to continue under Montgomery's authority. The crisis exposed a fundamental reality: Montgomery had finally pushed too far. His press conference, portraying American forces as incompetent and himself as their savior, had accomplished what 3 years of tactical disagreements could not. It had created absolute, uncompromising opposition among American commanders who controlled the majority of Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, documented the crisis in a classified memorandum dated January 8. "We are facing a complete breakdown in Allied command relationships. American generals are prepared to resign en masse rather than serve under British command. Montgomery's ego has created a situation more dangerous to Allied unity than German panzers." Winston Churchill, recognizing the catastrophic potential of the crisis, personally intervened. On January 9, he drafted a statement to the House of Commons that, while praising Montgomery, emphasized American contributions to the Ardennes battle. More importantly, he privately ordered Montgomery to issue a clarification of his press conference remarks. Montgomery's clarification, issued on January 11, was characteristically grudging. He acknowledged American forces' role in the battle but couldn't resist adding qualifications that suggested British direction had been essential to success. For American commanders, it was too little, too late, and too obviously coerced. The permanent damage had been done. General Eisenhower, in a personal letter to General George Marshall dated January 15, wrote with unusual candor, "Montgomery is a superb tactical commander when conducting set-piece battles with overwhelming force. But his inability to work cooperatively with Americans, his constant self-promotion, and his offensive superiority complex have made him a liability. I spend more time managing Montgomery's relationships than I do planning operations." The solution emerged through careful political maneuvering. American forces were quietly returned to American command. Montgomery retained nominal status as ground forces commander but with reduced actual authority. Future operations would be planned to minimize situations where American forces served under British command. The practicality was simple: the Americans now commanded 61 divisions in Europe versus 17 British and Canadian divisions. Industrial reality and force ratios had rendered Montgomery's pretensions mathematically irrelevant. The Americans no longer needed to tolerate what they would no longer accept. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. March 23, 1945. 2,100 hours. The Rhine River, Germany. Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder was finally underway, the British crossing of the last major water barrier protecting Germany's industrial heartland. Montgomery had spent weeks preparing, assembling 250,000 men, 4,000 artillery pieces, and stockpiling supplies that would sustain operations for a month. The preparation was vintage Montgomery, methodical, overwhelming, and absolutely certain of success. There was only one problem that gnawed at every American commander watching the operation unfold: General George S. Patton had already crossed the Rhine. Patton's crossing had occurred on March 22, nearly 24 hours before Montgomery's elaborate set-piece assault. With characteristic opportunism, Patton had identified a weakly defended sector near Oppenheim, assembled assault boats, and sent his 5th Infantry Division across before German forces could react. The crossing had been achieved with such speed that Patton famously stopped midstream to urinate in the Rhine, a gesture of contempt that would be photographed and celebrated in American newspapers. By the time Montgomery's massive bombardment announced his crossing to every German unit within 50 miles, Patton had 2 divisions across the Rhine and was expanding his bridgehead against minimal opposition. The contrast could not have been more stark or more humiliating for the British Field Marshal. Montgomery's response revealed everything American commanders had come to despise about his character. Rather than acknowledge Patton's achievement, Montgomery's official communiques simply ignored it. His operational reports to Eisenhower focused exclusively on Operation Plunder, describing it as the decisive Rhine crossing without mentioning that the river had already been breached 200 miles to the south. When forced to comment on Patton's crossing during a March 24 staff conference, Montgomery dismissed it as a mere assault crossing that lacked the logistical preparation for sustained operations. The fact that Patton's mere assault crossing was already pushing German forces into retreat while consuming a fraction of the resources Montgomery required seemed, once again, irrelevant to the British commander. American commanders' contempt reached new heights. General Bradley's diary entry from March 24 dripped with satisfaction. Montgomery has spent 3 weeks preparing to cross the Rhine with maximum force and minimal risk. Patton crossed it with minimum preparation and maximum audacity. One approach took 3 divisions across in one night. The other approach took 3 weeks to put 3 divisions across. History will judge which method better suited the circumstances. The Rhine crossing incidents crystallized the fundamental incompatibility between Montgomery and American military culture. Where Montgomery saw Patton's crossing as reckless opportunism that endangered forces through inadequate preparation, Americans saw it as brilliant exploitation of enemy weakness. Where Montgomery viewed his own careful preparation as professional military excellence, Americans saw it as ponderous overcaution that gave enemies time to prepare. Lieutenant General William Simpson, commanding the U.S. Ninth Army still under Montgomery's operational control, documented the British Field Marshal's reaction to American successes in a classified report. Montgomery appears genuinely unable to comprehend that different approaches to warfare can be equally valid. In his mind, there is the correct method, his method, and there is recklessness. That American methods consistently achieve results faster and with comparable or fewer casualties seems to have no impact on this assessment. The final weeks of the European War saw a remarkable shift in operational dynamics. American armies raced across Germany, covering hundreds of miles in weeks. Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced methodically toward the Baltic, achieving its objectives but always seeming to arrive after the critical moments had passed. Berlin, the ultimate prize, fell to Soviet forces while Montgomery was still consolidating positions 60 miles from the city. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Allied forces triumphant. But the victory had been achieved despite, not because of, Allied command unity. Montgomery's relationship with American commanders remained poisonous to the end. June 10, 1945. The Grand Hotel, Nuremberg. The victory celebrations were over, the champagne had been drunk, and the medals had been distributed. Now came the accounting, not of military victories, but of the command relationships that had nearly fractured the Allied coalition. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's final report to the combined chiefs of staff, classified until 1960, contained an extraordinary assessment of Montgomery. Written with the diplomatic restraint Eisenhower had maintained throughout the war, the report nevertheless painted a damning picture. The relevant section, found on page 87 of the document, read, "Field Marshal Montgomery is undoubtedly one of the great captains of this or any age. His tactical abilities are beyond question. However, his utility in coalition warfare is limited by an unfortunate personality trait, an absolute inability to acknowledge merit in approaches that differ from his own, and a compulsive need to claim credit for successes while attributing failures to others' deviation from his advice. More revealing were the private assessments American commanders committed to paper once freed from wartime censorship obligations. General Omar Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, contained passages that shocked readers with their bluntness about Allied command relationships. Bradley wrote, "Montgomery's generalship was competent but not brilliant, careful but not decisive. What made him insufferable was not his caution. Caution has its place in warfare, but his absolute conviction that his caution represented military genius while American audacity represented military ignorance. He could not simply disagree with our methods, he had to be dismissive, patronizing, and ultimately insulting." General Patton, who died in December 1945 before he could publish his full memoirs, left behind extensive diaries that his family would later release. His assessment of Montgomery was characteristically unvarnished. "Montgomery is a tired little man who has never understood that war is not won by avoiding defeat, but by actively seeking victory. He fights as though afraid to lose rather than determined to win. His caution is not prudence but timidity dressed in tactical sophistication." The statistical analysis compiled by U.S. Army historians told its own story. From D-Day to VE Day, American forces in Europe advanced an average of 1.4 miles per day of active operations. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery's command averaged 0.6 miles per day. American forces suffered 586,628 casualties while inflicting estimated German casualties of 2.3 million in their sectors. British and Canadian forces suffered 194,716 casualties while inflicting estimated German casualties of 435,000 in their sectors. The numbers suggested that American methods, accepting higher risk, emphasizing mobility and exploitation, trusting subordinate commanders' initiative, achieved results at least as efficiently as Montgomery's methodical approach, and often more so. Yet Montgomery never acknowledged this reality, even in retirement. British official histories, published in the 1950s and 1960s, attempted to provide balanced assessments. They acknowledged Montgomery's difficult personality while defending his tactical competence. But even British historians could not ignore the documented evidence of his troubled relationships with American commanders. The final assessment came from an unexpected source. In 1958, former German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was interviewed about Allied commanders he had faced. Asked about Montgomery, von Rundstedt's response was telling: "Montgomery was predictable. Always the careful preparation, always the overwhelming force, always the methodical execution. We knew what he would do because he always did the same thing." The Americans were different, Patton especially. They were unpredictable, aggressive, willing to take risks we didn't expect. Militarily, they were more dangerous opponents. The hatred American generals felt for Montgomery was never about his abilities as a commander. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Montgomery's genius, such as it was, could never compensate for his inability to treat American commanders as professional equals rather than talented amateurs requiring British guidance. The decades following World War II would provide the final judgment on the Montgomery-American command relationship, and that judgment was rendered not through historical revisionism but through the evolution of military doctrine itself. By the 1950s, as NATO began developing unified command structures for potential conflict with the Soviet Union, the lessons of Allied command dysfunction were painfully apparent. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization's command arrangements were specifically designed to prevent the kind of national friction that had plagued relations between Montgomery and American generals. Coalition warfare doctrine now emphasized unity of command, clear authority structures, and, most tellingly, rotation of senior positions among nations to prevent any single commander from dominating coalition operations. The U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth incorporated the Montgomery-American relationship into its curriculum as a case study in what to avoid in coalition operations. Classified studies from the 1960s, since declassified, explicitly analyzed how personality conflicts and national pride had compromised military effectiveness during World War II. One study, authored by Colonel Trevor Dupuy in 1964, concluded, The friction between Field Marshal Montgomery and American commanders represents a failure not of military competence but of coalition management. Both sides possessed valid military philosophies appropriate to their national capabilities and strategic circumstances. The tragedy was the inability to harness these different approaches cooperatively rather than competitively. Montgomery himself never fully grasped, or perhaps never accepted, the depth of American animosity toward him. His memoirs, published in 1958, portrayed his relationships with American commanders as fundamentally cordial with only minor disagreements. He seemed genuinely puzzled by American resentment, attributing it to national sensitivity rather than his own behavior. In a 1962 television interview, an aging Montgomery was asked directly about his wartime relationships with American generals. His response was revealing: "I got on perfectly well with the Americans once they understood proper military procedure. Bradley was quite sound once he learned to plan operations correctly. Even Patton, for all his theatrics, became manageable when properly directed." Eisenhower was, of course, a political general, not a fighting soldier, but he served his purpose. This statement, broadcast internationally, reignited old controversies. General Bradley, by then retired, responded in a rare public comment: "After all these years, Montgomery still doesn't understand. It wasn't that we needed to learn from him, it was that he needed to respect that different approaches could be equally valid." His inability to grasp this basic truth of coalition warfare was his fundamental failure as an Allied commander. The historical assessment has largely vindicated the American perspective. Modern military historians, analyzing the campaigns with access to complete archives from all sides, generally conclude that Montgomery's methods were appropriate for British circumstances, limited manpower requiring careful husbanding of resources, but poorly suited to American capabilities and unnecessarily dismissive of American operational art. Professor Carlo D'Este, in his comprehensive 1995 study Decision in Normandy, wrote, "Montgomery's tragedy was that his genuine tactical abilities were overshadowed by character flaws that made coalition command nearly impossible. Had he possessed the personal skills to match his military competence, the Allied campaign in Northwest Europe would have been far more efficient and far less acrimonious." The final word perhaps belongs to General Eisenhower himself. In a private letter to General Marshall written in 1947, declassified in 1972, Eisenhower reflected on his wartime command challenges. "Managing Montgomery was my greatest challenge of the war, more difficult than Kasserine, more stressful than the Bulge, more politically delicate than anything involving Stalin or Churchill. Not because he was incompetent, he wasn't. But because his ego required constant management, his sensitivity demanded constant attention, and his interactions with American commanders required constant intervention. I sometimes think we won the war despite our command structure rather than because of it." The hatred American generals felt for Bernard Montgomery was ultimately about a fundamental truth of modern warfare: in coalition operations, tactical brilliance without the ability to cooperate effectively with allies is not just insufficient, it's actively counterproductive. Montgomery possessed the former but catastrophically lacked the latter, and that combination nearly proved as dangerous to Allied unity as German panzers were to Allied armies. April 15, 1945. Army Group Headquarters, Lüneburg Heath, Germany. As British forces pushed toward the Baltic and American armies raced across southern Germany, a peculiar phenomenon was occurring in Allied planning rooms. What staff officers privately termed the Montgomery problem had evolved into something more insidious: the complete exclusion of British 21st Army Group from critical operational decisions. This wasn't deliberate sabotage or calculated revenge. It was something more telling. American planners had simply begun routing around Montgomery's command structure the way water flows around an obstruction. When speed was required, when bold action was needed, when exploitation of opportunities demanded immediate decision-making, American commanders stopped consulting Montgomery altogether. Lieutenant Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, documented this evolution in his operational diary. "We've developed an informal protocol. If an operation requires Montgomery's approval, we redesign it to avoid his sector entirely. It's not that we doubt his tactical competence, it's that we cannot afford the 3-day planning cycle, the demands for overwhelming force ratios, and the inevitable lecture on proper military procedure that consultation with British headquarters entails. This tactical quarantine of Montgomery represented something unprecedented in coalition warfare, not open rebellion, but passive circumvention. The organizational charts still showed Montgomery commanding 21st Army Group with specific geographical responsibilities. The reality was that American commanders planned operations to minimize interaction with British command structures wherever possible. The psychological dynamics were fascinating and deeply revealing. Montgomery had spent 3 years positioning himself as the military intellectual superior of American commanders, the experienced professional guiding talented but naive Americans through the complexities of modern warfare. By April 1945, this perception had inverted completely. American commanders viewed Montgomery not as a mentor but as an obstacle, brilliant perhaps, but fundamentally unsuited for the fast-moving, opportunity-driven warfare that was bringing Germany to its knees. General Karl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, captured this reversal in a letter to General Henry Hap Arnold dated April 20. Montgomery reminds me of a brilliant physics professor who cannot understand why students don't appreciate his lectures. He knows his subject intimately, explains it thoroughly, but completely fails to recognize that his audience stopped listening weeks ago. His tactical knowledge is encyclopedic, his ability to convey it cooperatively is non-existent. The comparison to academia was apt and frequently repeated in American assessments. Montgomery approached warfare like a scholar approaches research, methodical study, careful analysis, precise execution according to established principles. This worked brilliantly when he controlled all variables, when he could impose his timeline and his methods on the battlefield. But modern coalition warfare in 1945 was nothing like an academic exercise. It required compromise, adaptation, recognition that allies might employ different methods to achieve the same objectives. It demanded what Montgomery fundamentally lacked: intellectual humility, the ability to acknowledge that his approach, however successful in specific contexts, was not the only valid method of warfare. The Americans had coined a term for Montgomery's condition, Einstein syndrome, being so convinced of one's own intellectual superiority that collaboration becomes impossible. Just as Einstein's theoretical brilliance occasionally made him dismissive of experimental physicists' contributions, Montgomery's tactical acumen made him incapable of respecting different operational approaches. Major General J.F.M. Whiteley, a British officer serving on Eisenhower's staff, provided perhaps the most damning assessment from an Allied perspective in his post-war memoir. Montgomery's tragedy was that he was right about many things, his caution often was justified, his careful planning frequently was superior, his tactical instincts regularly proved sound. But he was right in a way that made cooperation impossible. He didn't just advocate for his methods, he demanded intellectual submission. American commanders weren't wrong to resist, they were wrong only in that they resisted too late and with too much accumulated bitterness. The statistical analysis compiled by SHAEF operations research teams told a sobering story. From January to May 1945, operations requiring British-American coordination took an average of 4.3 days longer to plan than purely American operations of comparable scope. Operations in Montgomery's sector advanced at 64% the speed of operations in adjacent American sectors when facing comparable opposition. These weren't failures of execution, Montgomery's forces performed their assigned missions effectively. They were failures of command philosophy imposed on a coalition that had evolved beyond the methodical approach that Montgomery considered the only professional standard. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff and perhaps the most frustrated man in the European theater, maintained detailed records of time spent managing Montgomery's relationships versus planning actual operations. His classified summary, written in May 1945, revealed that from January through April, SHAEF headquarters had devoted an estimated 847 staff hours to Montgomery-related command relationship management, nearly equivalent to the time spent planning the Rhine crossings. The opportunity cost was staggering. While staff officers mediated between Montgomery and American commanders, while diplomats soothed British sensitivities and American frustrations, the actual business of winning the war proceeded despite rather than because of the command structure. Perhaps most revealing was the planning for operations that never occurred, the proposed drive on Berlin, the contemplated thrust into Bavaria, the discussed advance toward Prague. In every case, American planners designed operations to avoid Montgomery's sector entirely, even when geographic logic suggested British participation. The military reasoning was sound. Operations in American sectors could be planned in 48 hours and executed with flexibility. Operations requiring Montgomery's involvement would take a week to plan, demand force ratios that delayed execution, and proceed with rigidity that eliminated tactical opportunism. Colonel Charles Bonesteel, working in SHAF operations, documented the final absurdity in a memo dated April 28. We have reached a point where British exclusion from operations is not an American preference but an operational necessity. Not because British forces are less capable, they're superbly trained and equipped, but because British command procedures are incompatible with the operational tempo that victory now requires. Montgomery has become a victim of his own success. His methods won when we had time for preparation, those same methods fail when victory demands exploitation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.